Picture this. It's 2012, right? And the president of the European Commission is standing on a grand stage in Oslo, smiling warmly, and he's accepting the Nobel Peace Prize on behalf of the European Union.
Right, the ultimate geopolitical gold medal.
Exactly. The applause in that hall was deafening. The official declaration was praising the EU as this absolute miracle of shared sovereignty, a brilliant new legal order that supposedly banished conflict from the continent forever.
That was the narrative, yeah. The grand European project.
Well, and here is the massive, counterintuitive slap in the face we are going to explore today. At the exact moment that gold medal was being handed over, the continent was quietly tearing itself apart. I mean, internal hostility, bitterness, resentment within the borders of the EU, it was at its absolute highest point in half a century.
Oh, the contrast is just staggering. You've got the rhetoric in Oslo on one hand, and on the other you have a monetary system that was actively pitting nations against each other. It was brutal on the ground.
Welcome to today's deep dive. If you're looking for, a polite, sanitized recitation of European history, you are in the wrong place. We are looking at the raw mechanics of a financial thriller today.
Definitely a thriller. No academic fluff here.
Right. Our mission today is to uncover why the most noble honor for peace actually masked the deepest, quietest fracturing of a modern empire. And to guide us, we're relying on a deeply prescient piece of research.
Yeah, so we are pulling from a 2013 National Bureau of Economic Research working paper, and it's by Martin Feldstein.
A heavy hitter.
Oh, absolutely. Feldstein was a titan of economics at Harvard. He was a former chief economic advisor to the Reagan administration. Just a massive voice in global monetary policy. But when you read this specific paper, you realize he was acting almost like a prophet.
He saw the cracks before anyone else did.
Exactly. He saw straight through the political theater of the Eurozone crisis well over a decade ago. He looked at the data, and he predicted the structural tear of the European Union with a level of accuracy that is, well, it's almost chilling in hindsight.
It really is. Now, before we dive in, we need to be crystal clear with you. We are looking at deeply political and economic strategies today, stuff that touches on intense, ongoing national debates across Europe.
Very heated debates.
Yeah. So we are not taking sides. We aren't endorsing the left-wing or right-wing views of Europe, nor are we validating these policies ourselves. Our mission is strictly to impartially unpack the fascinating raw facts and arguments laid out in Professor Feldstein's research so you can understand the mechanics of this crisis.
Right, just following the data where it leads.
Okay, let's unpack this. I want to start with what looked, at least to the outside world, like this magical financial rescue. But underneath, it was a deeply controversial gamble.
You're talking about the European Central Bank, the ECB, in 2012.
The money printer.
Yeah. Exactly. So to set the stage, the Eurozone is essentially engulfed in a sovereign debt crisis. You've got countries like Spain and Italy watching the interest rates on their government debt just skyrocket. It was completely unsustainable.
The markets were basically betting they were going to go bankrupt, right?
Right. So the ECB steps in and announces this new policy mechanism. They called it OMT, outright monetary transactions.
Which I just have to say is a brilliant piece of boring bureaucratic branding.
It really is.
Like, it sounds like a routine software update for an APM. It completely hides how explosive the policy actually was.
Oh, it's a very dry name for a completely revolutionary promise. On paper, the ECB basically declared they were prepared to buy unlimited amounts of short-term government bonds from struggling nations like Spain and Italy.
Unlimited, that's a big word.
Huge. The only catch was that those countries had to formally apply for financial aid and agree to incredibly strict, externally monitored economic conditions.
Okay, wait, let me stop you there, because the mechanics of this are crucial. And we promised no academic jargon.
Right. Keep it simple.
So when we talk about buying bonds and interest rates dropping, what is actually happening under the hood? Like, if I'm the government of Italy and I need cash to keep the lights on, how does the ECB buying my bonds save me?
Well, it just comes down to the basic law of supply and demand for debt. So when a government runs a deficit, they issue bonds, basically just IOUs, and they sell them to investors.
Okay, makes sense.
But if investors think the government is risky, like they might not pay them back, they demand a higher interest rate or yield as compensation for taking on that risk. So in 2012, investors were terrified of Italy and Spain.
Right. They thought those IOUs were worthless.
Exactly. So to convince anyone to buy them, Italy and Spain had to offer higher and higher interest rates. And it becomes this death spiral. The higher the interest rate, the more expensive it is for the government to service its debt.
Which just makes them even more likely to default.
Exactly. So the ECB steps in and acts as the buyer of last resort. They tell the market, hey, if no one else will buy Italian bonds, we will. And we have an unlimited printing press.
Wow. So by creating this artificial guaranteed demand, the ECB instantly lowers the interest rates Italy and Spain have to pay.
Yep. The mere announcement of the OMT policy worked almost like magic. Panic subsided, borrowing costs dropped, crisis solved. Right, at least according to the press releases.
Right, but the flip side of that, and this is where Feldstein's analysis gets really sharp, is that this wasn't actually monetary policy at all.
Not even close.
Because central banks are supposed to manage the money supply and inflation for the whole zone. They aren't supposed to target the specific debts of individual struggling nations. Feldstein points out this was a massive fiscal transfer disguise.
Yeah, what's fascinating here is that it was a bluff of epic proportions. And it was a bluff that relied disproportionately on the balance sheet of one specific country, Germany.
And this is where the resentment starts boiling over.
Exactly. You have to look at the structure of the ECB itself. It isn't just this magical entity floating in the cloud. It's funded and backed by the national central banks of its member countries. It's based on what they call a capital key.
Meaning liability is shared based on the size of a country's economy.
Right. So if the ECB buys hundreds of billions of euros worth of Spanish and Italian bonds, and then Spain and Italy eventually go bankrupt anyway.
Those bonds become worthless.
Yes. The ECB takes a catastrophic loss. And those losses don't just vanish. They are absorbed by the shareholders of the ECB. Because Germany has the largest economy, German taxpayers would ultimately be on the hook for a massive portion of those losses.
Oh, man. So Feldstein points out that Germany would bear roughly 40% of the burden if the southern nations defaulted.
40%, yes.
Okay, let me try an analogy to ground this.
Yeah.
Because it's wild. Imagine you live in a neighborhood with a really powerful homeowners association, and a few houses down the street start structurally collapsing because the owners took out massive second mortgages, bought sports cars, and didn't fix the foundations.
Okay, I like where this is going.
So the HOA board holds an emergency meeting, and they say, don't worry, the HOA will use its collective funds to buy up the debt of these failing houses to keep them afloat. But you, as the homeowner with the biggest, nicest house on the block, look at the bylaws and realize, wait a minute, if those houses collapse anyway, I am personally liable to pay 40% of the HOA's losses through a special assessment.
It's infuriating, right? And to push your analogy further, the owners of those failing houses are also furious.
Really? Why?
Because the HOA isn't just buying their debt for free. The HOA is demanding the right to come into their homes, audit their personal bank accounts, and dictate their grocery budgets in exchange for the health.
Oh, wow. It's a mechanism practically engineered to generate hatred on both sides.
Exactly. Southern Europe flat out refused the humiliating conditions attached to the bailout. They saw it as surrendering their sovereignty to unelected auditors in Brussels. Meanwhile, the German public was furious at the prospect of their tax heroes underwriting what they viewed as decades of financial recklessness in the South.
Which creates an incredible paradox. The OMT, this ultimate bazooka that was supposed to save the euro, became a loaded weapon sitting on a table that absolutely no one dared to fire.
Right. Neither the borrowers wanted to trigger the loans, nor did the German public want the loans issued. The market stayed calm purely because the weapon was visible, but the supposed European coordination behind it. Complete illusion.
Okay, let's trace this back, though, because it begs a massive question. How did the Eurozone get to a point where a loaded weapon on a table was the only thing stopping total collapse?
We have to look at the fatal lie.
Right, because before 2010, the idea of a European nation defaulting on its debt was considered an impossibility. It was like financial science fiction.
It was an unquestionable article of faith. The whole architecture of the euro was built on the assumption that sovereign debt within the union was inherently safe. For a decade, global investors treated the government bonds of Greece, Spain, and Italy as if they carried the exact same risk as the bonds of Germany.
Which is mathematically absurd in hindsight.
Totally absurd.
I mean, you had economies with vastly different productivity levels, different tax collection rates, different pension liabilities, but the market priced their debt identically, just because they all use the same currency.
Right, but that illusion of zero risk held firm until the spring of 2010.
The spark hitting the dry kindling.
Exactly. Greece comes forward with a stunning admission. Their national accounting was a complete fiction. Their books had been cooked for years.
They basically stepped up to the microphone and said, yeah, we know we told you our deficit was manageable, but it's actually vastly higher. Same with our national debt. We've been lying to the world.
And the psychological shock of that cannot be overstated. When a sovereign government admits to systemic fraud on that scale, the market's core belief system vaporizes overnight. Investors looked at Greece, realized the numbers were fake, and immediately turned their heads to the rest of the continent.
Asking who else is lying? Who else is drowning in off-balance sheet debt?
Precisely. Panic operates like a plague. It doesn't respect borders.
And the sheer scale of the math here is terrifying, because as Feldstein points out, Greece is tiny. In the grand scheme, it's maybe 2% of the Eurozone's GDP. A Greek default would be painful, sure, but a giant economy like Germany could absorb the blow. It's an irritant.
But the panic didn't stop at the Greek border. It jumped to Italy and Spain.
And this is where the math breaks the system.
Yes, because Italian debt was sitting well over 100% of its GDP. Spain's debt was lower, but climbing at an alarming rate because they were trying to bail out their domestic banks after a massive housing bubble burst.
I really want to emphasize the sheer size of Italy and Spain for you, because if we look at Feldstein's data, they're not minor irritants. Combined, the gross domestic product of Italy and Spain is larger than the GDP of Germany.
Larger than Germany, yes.
Yeah.
That is the mathematical reality that drove the panic to apocalyptic levels. If those two massive dominoes fall, the entire European vault simply does not hold enough money to catch them.
The safety net was too small for the acrobats.
Exactly. The bailout funds they had cobbled together had nowhere near the firepower to rescue economies of that size simultaneously.
So the house is burning down. The roof is caving in. The fire extinguishers are empty. How do the political leaders in Brussels and Berlin react to this existential terror? Because Feldstein argues they didn't just see a crisis.
No, they saw leverage. They adhere to the old political adage, never let a serious crisis go to waste.
Ah, of course.
According to Feldstein, German Chancellor Angela Merkel and the bureaucratic establishment in Brussels looked at this panic and saw a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. They wanted to force a massive leap in European political integration.
Accelerating the quote-unquote European project.
Yes, the narrative they sold to the public was, look, this crisis is definitive proof that sovereign states are too weak, too undisciplined to survive alone. You need to surrender your independent financial powers to a centralized authority in Brussels. Let us protect you.
Wow. So they rolled out this three-step master plan, right, to basically hijack the power.
That's certainly how the member states felt. Step 1 was the fiscal compact. That was supposed to strictly limit national deficits. Step 2 was the banking union, centralizing all bank supervision. And step 3 was budget control.
I want to pause on step 3, budget control, because it is vital to understand how radical a shift this was.
It was a massive overreach.
Think about this from the perspective of an everyday citizen, right? You're a voter in Portugal or the Netherlands. You go to the polls, you elect your local representatives to parliament based on what they promise to spend on your roads, your schools, your hospital.
Basics of democracy.
Right. And suddenly, Brussels is proposing a system where an unelected official sitting 800 miles away can draw a red line through your country's elected budget and say, no, you can't build that hospital, you need to pay down your debt.
It's a fundamental dilution of democratic sovereignty. Imagine your local bank telling you that to protect your money, they need complete control over your household budget. Would you agree to that?
Never. Not a chance.
Exactly. And that is why it generated such profound friction. Brussels framed these steps as necessary coordination to save the euro. But Feldstein points out the member states perceived it as a demand for subservience.
Which perfectly explains why these grand ironclad agreements began to disintegrate the moment they hit reality. Let's look at step 1, the fiscal compact.
Right.
Chancellor Merkel stood before the cameras and hailed this as a historic milestone for Europe. This was supposed to be the new constitutional law to end all bad financial behavior.
On paper, it was incredibly strict. Mandatory annual debt reductions, severe caps on deficits, and crucially, automatic, severe financial penalties for any nation that broke the rules.
Iron laws.
Supposedly.
But then you look at the actual data Feldstein presents. The implementation was basically non-existent. Deficits stayed high, national debts continued to climb, and the number of those severe automatic penalties actually issued.
Zero. Absolutely zero.
The laws were reduced to waste paper instantly.
They were. And honestly, it wasn't a surprise to anyone who knew the history of the Eurozone. Because this exact scenario had played out before.
Wait, really? When?
Feldstein highlights this perfect, embarrassing precedent. A decade earlier, the EU created the Stability and Growth Pact. Same goals, limiting deficits to 3% of GDP.
So they already had a foundation to prevent this whole crisis.
Yes, but it didn't work. And do you know why?
Tell me.
Because of the actions of the very countries demanding the rules. In the early 2000s, Germany and France both hit economic slowdowns, and both countries intentionally allowed their budget deficits to exceed that sacred 3% limit.
Hold on, let me make sure I'm tracking this. The two largest, most powerful economies in the Union broke the rules they themselves helped write.
Yes. And when it came time for the European Commission to impose the legally mandated penalties on France and Germany, the political pressure was immense. The result, the rules were effectively suspended.
That is wild.
France and Germany trampled over the pack the moment it became economically inconvenient for them. They made the rules toothless.
So when Brussels rolls out the new fiscal compact in 2012, and Merkel is like, this time we really mean it, nobody with an ounce of historical memory takes it seriously.
Exactly. The threat of penalties was an empty suit. The precedent of hypocrisy had already been set by the biggest players.
That credibility gap is just fatal. If the rules don't apply to the powerful, you can't enforce them on the weak.
And this lack of genuine solidarity bleeds directly into step 2, the banking union.
Right. Because this is where the tension between France and Germany really bubbles up. France is looking at the failing banks in Southern Europe, and frankly, looking at the exposure of their own French banks to all that bad debt, and they are terrified.
Panic mode.
So French officials start begging for a unified European deposit insurance program, using everyone's money to save weak Southern banks.
And, the mechanics of deposit insurance are usually pretty straightforward at a national level. Banks pay into a central fund, and if one bank fails, the fund makes sure everyday depositors don't lose their life savings.
Yeah.
It stops bank runs. France wanted to elevate this to a continental level. One giant pot of money to guarantee deposits anywhere in the Eurozone.
But if I'm Germany, I'm looking at this and doing the math. Because German banks were, generally speaking, much more conservative during this period. Spanish banks, meanwhile, were drowning in toxic real estate rot.
Right. You're hitting on the exact concept of moral hazard that drove Germany's reaction. Germany gave a cold, hard no. From Berlin's perspective, a unified insurance scheme just meant using the strength of healthy German banks to act as a shield for the toxic rot in weaker economies.
They refused to let their prudent savers become a piggy bank for someone else's housing bubble.
Exactly.
It completely shreds the narrative of European solidarity. They were happy to talk about building a protective umbrella, but when the storm hit, Germany refused to let the weaker nations stand under it.
So the banking union stalled. The core element sharing the risk was blocked. Which brings us to step 3, budget control.
Right. The plan to veto national budgets. We mentioned this earlier, and here's where it gets really interesting. Because the pushback was violent.
Oh, the moment the European Commission reached for the sovereign purse strings, the illusion of teamwork shattered. National parliaments revolted. They argued that a nation without control over its own taxation and spending is no longer a sovereign nation. It's a province.
The pushback was so intense the plan was infinitely postponed, dead on arrival.
So look at the scorecard. The fiscal compact. Ignored.
Yeah.
Banking union, stripped of shared risk, budget control, sparked a revolt. The master plan to use the crisis to force a political union completely collapsed.
Which leads to a deeply cynical realization. You have all these politicians on TV singing hymns of European teamwork, accepting Nobel Prizes, but Feldstein's analysis cuts through all that noise.
It was a bloody, every man for himself knife fight behind closed doors.
Exactly.
Feldstein states this with brutal clarity. Literally all fiscal improvements in the Eurozone during this time were the result of desperate, unilateral self-rescue missions by individual countries. They were totally disconnected from Brussels' supposed coordination.
Let's look at the human cost of that. Let's look at Italy. Because on a spreadsheet, Italy's response was framed as a success story.
Yeah, the international community loved the spreadsheet.
But the reality is an economic tragedy.
You have to look at their leadership change. Late 2011, worst of the panic, the political government falls. Italy brings in a technocratic prime minister, Mario Monti.
And as a technocrat and economist, he doesn't have to worry about winning an immediate election. He just needs to fix the math.
Right. His mandate was basically convince the bond markets Italy won't default. So Monti implements incredibly aggressive austerity. He violently hikes real estate taxes. He slashes pensions, forcing people to work longer.
Just brutal cuts.
And if you only looked at the IMF projections, Monti was a hero. They predicted Italy would achieve a structural surplus on paper.
Okay, let's define structural surplus because it sounds like a good thing. It sounds like the government is taking in more money than it's spending.
It's an economic concept that tries to calculate what the budget would look like if the economy were operating at full, normal capacity. It tries to ignore the temporary effects of a recession.
But it's an accounting fiction.
A total fiction that ignores human reality.
Because you can't just hike taxes in a vacuum. Monti's austerity pulled so much money out of the private sector, he effectively strangled the actual economy. Businesses stop investing, consumers stop spending, and the economy shrinks into a deep recession.
He tried to cure the disease of debt by starving the patient.
Exactly. And what does that do to the actual math? If the economy shrinks, businesses aren't making profits, people lose their jobs, which means nobody's paying income taxes.
Right. The actual tax revenues plummeted. So despite these massive tax hikes, the real-world budget was still bleeding in a deficit. The structural numbers looked pretty to Brussels, but the reality was millions of Italians losing their livelihoods.
It's so cruel. And then you look over at Spain, and they have a completely different nightmare because Spain actually tried to do the hard work. They actively restructured their failing banks.
They did. Madrid made some painful moves, but their macroeconomic data was still horrific. Unemployment hit 25%.
A quarter of the workforce.
Yes, and their budget deficit was stuck around 7% of GDP.
But why couldn't they reform that? If Madrid was willing to fix the banks, why couldn't they just mandate spending cuts to fix the deficit?
Because of a fatal constitutional flaw. After the Franco dictatorship ended, Spain's new democracy granted an incredibly high degree of autonomy to its individual regions. Places like Catalonia and Andalusia.
Right.
These regional governments control massive portions of public spending, healthcare, education.
So the central government in Madrid can go to Brussels, shake hands, promise to cut national spending.
But the promises meant nothing back home. Madrid simply didn't have the constitutional authority to force the autonomous regions to slash their budgets.
Because the local politicians answer to their local voters who are suffering from 25% unemployment, they're going to refuse austerity.
Exactly. It's a dead knot. And it exposes the absurdity of the European integration argument. If a sovereign nation like Spain lacks the internal mechanisms to coordinate its own provinces, how on earth is a supranational entity like the EU supposed to coordinate 17 distinctly different nations?
It's an administrative impossibility. The coordination was a myth. Everyone was just fighting for survival alone.
Right.
Okay, we need to take a massive step back here because everything we've talked about, the bailouts, the failed laws, the austerity, these are symptoms. If we want to understand the disease, we have to look at why these wildly different countries were locked in this monetary prison in the first place.
We have to look at the original architects of the euro.
Yes. This is where Feldstein's analysis shifts into this fascinating geopolitical history. Let's talk about the French conspiracy.
Well, it certainly challenges the standard optimistic narrative. We're taught the euro was created for prosperity, frictionless trade, peace. But Feldstein and other historians point out a much more aggressive, hidden agenda. The euro wasn't created for prosperity. It was a weapon.
A weapon designed to assassinate the German mark.
Exactly. To grasp this, you go back to the decades following World War II. French officials, guys like Jean Monnet, Robert Schuman, and later Jacques Delors, they pushed for a united Europe. But from their perspective, a united Europe was a vehicle for French global influence.
They wanted to drag the crown back to Paris.
Right. They wanted France to be a global superpower again. But there was a massive obstacle, West Germany, and specifically the absolute supremacy of the German economy and the Deutschmark.
The Bundesbank's global dominance.
You have to understand the psychology of the Bundesbank in the 70s and 80s. Germany was deeply traumatized by the hyperinflation of the 1920s. So the Bundesbank had one sacred mandate: fight inflation at all costs. They were ruthlessly independent. If the economy overheated, they hiked interest rates aggressively, making the Deutschmark incredibly strong and stable.
Okay, but how does German inflation fighting hurt France? Why did Paris care?
Because of the exchange rate mechanism, the ERM, which preceded the euro, European countries agreed to peg their currencies to each other to prevent wild trade fluctuations. Because the Deutschmark was the anchor, the Bundesbank basically dictated monetary policy for the whole continent.
Oh, I see.
If unelected German bankers in Frankfurt raised rates to fight inflation in Munich, the French central bank had to immediately raise their own interest rates to keep the French franc pegged to the mark.
Wait, let me work through that. If France has high unemployment, they want to lower interest rates to stimulate business, right? But you're saying if Germany raised rates, France was forced to match them, actively hurting their own economy just to maintain the peg.
Exactly. France felt like a monetary vassal state. They despised that they had to sacrifice French employment to satisfy German anti-inflation hawks.
So they decide to kill the mark.
Delors spearheads the single currency campaign. The public pitch is one market, one money. But the hidden agenda was to strip Germany of the Deutschmark, neutralize the Bundesbank, and create a European central bank where France would have an equal vote.
Drag the power from Frankfurt to Paris. And the incredible part is how they actually achieved this. It was a staggering act of extortion.
It really was. Late 1989, the Berlin Wall falls. West German Chancellor Helmut Kohl desperately wants to reunite with East Germany, but he needs the diplomatic blessing of France.
And French President Mitterrand holds German reunification hostage.
The unspoken ultimatum was clear. France would support a united Germany, but only if Germany agreed to permanently surrender the Deutschmark and adopt the euro.
Kohl choked down the bitter pill. He sacrificed his nation's beloved currency to get his country back together. It sounds like the ultimate French victory, right? A flawless checkmate. But Feldstein asks the critical question. Did France actually win?
And the answer is a resounding no. This is the tragic irony. It backfired spectacularly. France built a monetary cage for Germany, but they ended up locking themselves inside it.
The servant who outsmarted himself. Walk me through the mechanics of that backfire. How did giving up the mark make Germany stronger?
It comes down to economic productivity and losing a safety valve. Historically, German industry is highly efficient. When France still had the franc and their economy became uncompetitive compared to German exports, France had a simple tool: devaluation.
Making your currency cheaper.
Right. It sounds counterintuitive, but it's a powerful survival tool. If France devalues the francs, German imports become very expensive for French citizens, which hurts consumers. But for a foreign buyer, like an American, French goods suddenly become incredibly cheap.
So French exports explode, factories hire workers, and the economy is revitalized. It's an emergency pressure release valve.
Exactly. But the moment France joined the euro, they threw that valve away. They were locked into a currency heavily propped up by the hyper-efficient German economy. France couldn't cheat their way to competitiveness anymore. They had to compete with Germany head-to-head on pure productivity.
And they couldn't do it. Without the ability to devalue, the French industrial base rotted. They were saddled with a currency that was too strong for their actual output. They became a hostage to the very German economic supremacy they tried to contain.
And because Germany's economy remained the anchor, when the 2010 crisis hit, it was Angela Merkel setting the rules for the whole continent.
Yeah.
France was trapped as a servant to its own trap.
It is wild, and it leads to this invisible time bomb. Because if you look at France's terrifying current state during the crisis, deficits blowing up, double-digit unemployment, banks stuffed with toxic assets, their data mirrored Italy's disaster.
France was in severe distress.
But here's the illusion. The markets were punishing Italy, charging them massive interest rates. But the markets were charging France an interest rate almost equal to Germany's. Why the illusion of safety for France?
Feldstein argues it was a fragile illusion based on historical prestige. The markets just assumed France was too big to fail, and that Germany would always bail them out to save the euro. But Feldstein warns that relying on that psychological illusion is incredibly dangerous. France was fundamentally fragile.
And when you look at all of this, the South suffocating, Germany furious, France trapped, it's no wonder the ink wasn't even dry before the first giant prepared to rip itself away.
We have to talk about the prophesied imperial rift.
Brexit. And remember, it's 2013 in Feldstein's paper. Britain is still in the EU. The vote isn't until 2016, but Feldstein sees the writing on the wall.
His foresight is remarkable. Britain was unique. They kept the pound, so they weren't in the euro straitjacket. But the regulatory discontent was boiling over. Britain knew Brussels' endless regulations were a systemic missile aimed directly at London's status of a global financial hub.
Brussels wanted to drag London down to continental standards.
Right, plus the cultural chasm. The British public felt fundamentally alienated from the continent. Polls already showed a majority wanted out.
So what does this all mean? If Britain leaves, what happens?
The domino effect. Britain was the ultimate counterweight against French and German centralization. If the UK leaves, the delicate balance is destroyed. Nations like Finland and the Netherlands, fiscally conservative countries, tired of paying for southern bailouts, are suddenly standing right on the edge.
Ready to jump next?
Exactly. The contagion of political fracture is just as lethal as debt.
It's just staggering. But before we wrap up, if this massive meltdown couldn't force true European teamwork, who is the G20 actually fooling?
The exquisite lie of global coordination.
Because post-2007, the G20 took a massive victory lap. They claimed their unprecedented coordination saved the world.
And Feldstein uses the data to tear this down completely. True coordination requires sacrifice, taking a hit for the global team. But every single country took actions based only on aggressive self-interest. Zero sacrifices were made.
The U.S. pumped stimulus to save U.S. banks. China built infrastructure to save Chinese factories. Germany protected German exports.
It was just a coincidence of timing, branded as cooperation. It's like 20 people in a theater when a fire breaks out. They all sprint for the exit simultaneously to save themselves. But once outside, they hold a press conference and claim they just executed a choreographed dance routine.
That is a perfect analogy. They were running for their lives and gave each other medals for teamwork. Which brings us to the final trap, the unyielding noose.
The one emergency exit that could save Southern Europe, welded shut by their own leaders.
We talked about this with France, but it's the core tragedy. Countries like Spain and Italy have massive current account deficits. They import way more than they export, living on a national credit card.
And the only real cure for a massive current account deficit is devaluation. Make your currency cheaper to boost exports and save your industries.
But the straitjacket, they surrendered their currencies for the euro. They cannot devalue.
Right.
Could the ECB step in and devalue the euro for everyone?
Technically, yes. Will they? No. Because lowering the euro imports inflation into Germany, and Germany won't allow that. The mechanism is locked. The gears are rusting. What saves the weak punishes the strong.
So the paralyzed giant just forces the South into internal devaluation, slashing wages, gutting pensions, mass unemployment, a slow suffocation.
It is a profound tragedy.
So let's bring this massive journey to a close. To summarize, the EU was awarded a Nobel Peace Prize for a unity that didn't exist. Behind the curtain, coordination is an empty buzzword. The euro was a political weapon that backfired on its creators. And the very mechanism meant to save struggling nations, the single currency, has become a suffocating noose they cannot escape.
And I'll leave you with a chilling question that builds on Feldstein's logic. If this highly structured, rigid monetary union paralyzes its members during a predictable debt crisis, what happens when a completely unprecedented asymmetrical shock hits the globe? A shock where one half of Europe needs a fire hose of cash and the other half demands immediate austerity. When the rules finally snap, it won't just be a currency that fails, it will be the idea of Europe itself.
A terrifying thought to mull over. Thank you for joining us on this intense deep dive. Remember, true understanding comes from looking past the shiny press conferences and digging into the raw mechanics of power. Keep questioning the narrative, and we'll see you next time. Goodbye.